Clara's laughter was a delicate, crystalline thing, sharp enough to cut glass. It tinkled through the oppressive silence of the grand dining room, a sound Liam had once found enchanting. Now, it was the sound of the executioner's bell. "You have to understand, Liam," she said, her voice laced with a condescending pity that was far more insulting than outright scorn. She gestured with a wine glass, the deep red, liquid sloshing precariously close to the rim. The massive diamond on her finger, a gift from her father, caught the light of the chandelier and fractured it into 100 tiny, mocking rainbows. "You're a guest here. In this house, in this family. You bring nothing. You own nothing." Her father, Marcus Thorne, a man built of port wine and self-satisfaction, nodded in solemn agreement from the head of the long mahogany table. Her brother, Julian, smirked into his napkin, a weak echo of his father's arrogance. They formed a perfect, unified tableau of disdain. Liam did not react. He sat perfectly still, his posture immaculate, a stark contrast to the entitled slouch of the Thorns. His gaze was fixed on his wife, but it was a distant, analytical look, as if he were an architect studying the fatal flaw in a beautiful but doomed structure. His hands rested in his lap, calm and steady. Beside his chair, almost unnoticed on the priceless Aubusson rug, sat a simple, worn leather portfolio. It was old, its corners softened with age, its surface bearing the faint scars of 1,000 journeys. To the Thorns, it was just another symbol of his mediocrity, a shabby accessory for a shabby man. They thought he was a charity case, a quiet, unassuming man they had generously allowed into their orbit. They didn't know he was not in their orbit at all. They were in his. They thought he owned nothing. They had no idea that he owned everything. He owned the table at which they sat, the wine they drank, the very portraits of their ancestors staring down from the walls. Within 1 hour, their entire world, a world they believed to be as solid and eternal as granite, would be reduced to dust and memory. And he, the man with nothing, would be the one holding the hammer. We've all felt underestimated, haven't we? That sting of being judged on the surface, of having our true worth overlooked. It's a universal feeling, a quiet anger that simmers beneath the surface. I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight as we unpack this story. Drop your city or country in the comments. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Now let's go back. Let's see how a man of immense power could be so mistaken for a man of none, and how a family so convinced of their own supremacy could be so devastatingly, so completely wrong. The beginning, like so many tragic stories, was rooted in a misunderstanding. When Clara Thorne first met Liam Sterling, she saw in him a port in the storm of her own life. Her family, the Thornes of Thorne Consolidated, were a tempest of high drama, ostentatious wealth, and brittle egos. They lived their lives on a stage, every dinner a performance, every conversation a negotiation for status. Liam was the opposite. He was an architect, a profession her father would later dismiss as a noble hobby, but to Clara, it seemed profound. He spoke of foundations, of structural integrity, of creating spaces that serve people. He was quiet where her family was loud, thoughtful where they were impulsive, and possessed a stillness that she mistook for simplicity. He was handsome in an unobtrusive way, with kind eyes and a patience that seemed limitless. He listened more than he spoke, a quality the Thornes, who adored the sound of their own voices, found both baffling and convenient. They met at a gallery opening, a place Liam had gone to study the use of light and space, and a place Clara had gone to be seen. She was surrounded by a coterie of fawning admirers, but her eyes kept drifting to the man standing alone by a window, sketching in a small notebook, seemingly oblivious to the social whirlwind around him. Their courtship was a study in contrasts. He took her to see unfinished buildings, skeletons of steel and concrete, and spoke with passion about their potential. She took him to charity galas where the cost of the champagne could have funded a small hospital, and spoke with breathless excitement about who was wearing whom. She saw his quiet life as a project, a blank canvas onto which she could project the trappings of her own world. He saw her, as a woman trapped in a gilded cage, and he wondered if she had the strength to find the door. The first true crack in the facade appeared 6 months into their marriage, at the annual Thorne family Christmas Eve dinner. It was a command performance, a ritual of power and patronage presided over by the family patriarch, Marcus Thorne. The dining room was suffocatingly opulent, decorated in crimson and gold, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and roasting goose. Liam, dressed in a simple but well-tailored dark suit, had felt like an anthropologist observing a strange, isolated tribe. The conversation was a volley of brand names, vacation destinations, and thinly veiled boasts. When there was a momentary lull, Marcus turned his full, overbearing attention to his son-in-law. Liam, he boomed, his voice accustomed to filling boardrooms and silencing dissent. Clara tells me your little firm landed a small municipal contract. A library, was it? Liam met his gaze without flinching. A community center, Marcus, includes a library, yes, and a daycare and learning facilities for adults. Marcus chuckled, a low, dismissive rumble. He took a long, slow sip of a claret that cost more than Liam's first car. How quaint. Tell me, what does a project like that even gross? A few $100,000? It's admirable, I suppose. A sort of public service. He waved a dismissive hand. Architecture. A noble hobby, to be sure. But it doesn't build empires, does it, my boy? It doesn't forge a legacy. The insult hung in the air, glittering and sharp. It wasn't just a dismissal of Liam's career. It was a dismissal of his entire being, his values, his purpose. It was a declaration that in the Thorne universe, value was measured only in dollars, and legacy only in the accumulation of power. Liam felt Clara's hand tense on his arm under the table. He waited for her to speak, to defend him, to say anything. Instead, she laughed. It was a nervous, high-pitched sound, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm her father had just blasted open. Oh, Daddy, don't tease him. Liam works very hard on his little buildings. His little buildings, the diminishment, coming from her, was 1,000 times sharper than her father's blustering arrogance. It was a betrayal, small but precise, delivered with a smile. Liam's expression did not change. He held Marcus's gaze, his own eyes calm and clear. An empire built on a weak foundation will collapse, Marcus. A legacy is not just what you accumulate. It's what you create. Some people create wealth. I prefer to create value. They aren't always the same thing. The response was so measured, so devoid of the anger or deference Marcus expected, that it momentarily threw him off balance. He grunted, unsure if he had been subtly insulted or simply lectured by a man he considered his inferior. He decided to interpret it as naivete. A lovely sentiment, he said, turning away. Pass the gravy, Julian. The moment passed. The conversation moved on. But for Liam, a switch had been flipped. The observation period was over. He had seen the fault lines, the arrogance, the casual cruelty. And he had seen his wife, when presented with her first real test of loyalty, choose the comfort of her father's approval over the dignity of her husband. Later that night, long after Clara had fallen asleep, still buzzing from the champagne and the drama, Liam went to his study. It was a modest room, furnished with a simple desk, shelves of books on design and history, and a single, comfortable armchair. He unlocked a drawer in his desk and took out a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was of a piece with his portfolio, old, functional, and built to last. He opened it to a fresh page. The pages before were filled with his neat, precise script, detailing transactions, ownership structures, and numbered accounts. On the new page, he wrote the date. Underneath it, he wrote, Project Themis. Phase 1, Assessment. Subject, Thorne family. Primary weakness, arrogance. Secondary weakness, a priori assumptions based on superficial data. Catalyst, M. Thorne. Enabler, C. Thorne Sterling. He paused, his pen hovering over the page. He thought of Clara's laugh, that tinkling, treacherous sound. He added a final note. Emotional leverage, significant. Collateral risk, high. He then closed the ledger, locked it in the drawer, and sat in the dark for a long time, the silence of the house a stark contrast to the complex machinery that had just begun to turn in his mind. The game had begun. They had set the board, and they had made the first move. They just didn't know they were playing against the master. The humiliation, once it began, was not a sudden flood but a slow, rising tide. It seeped into the foundations of their marriage, staining everything with the murky water of disrespect. The Thorns operated with the serene confidence of people who had never been told no. They treated Liam not as a son-in-law, but as a peculiar acquisition of Clara's, one whose value they were constantly, and publicly, reassessing and finding wanting. A year into the marriage, Clara decided they needed a proper house. The comfortable, modern apartment Liam owned, a space he had designed himself, was deemed insufficient. "It's lovely, darling," she had said, her voice dripping with false sincerity, "but it's not a family home. We need a Thorn home." Liam knew he could afford any house she desired. His architectural firm, Sterling Designs, was quietly becoming one of the most respected boutique firms in the country, sought after by a discerning clientele for its innovative and understated brilliance. His personal investments, managed with the same meticulous precision he applied to his blueprints, had grown into a fortune that would have staggered the Thorns had they ever bothered to inquire. But they never inquired. They assumed. "Of course," Liam had replied calmly. "Let's start looking at listings." This was not how Clara, or by extension, her family, intended for things to proceed. The next evening, Marcus Thorn arrived at their apartment, unannounced, carrying a thick binder. He settled himself into Liam's favorite armchair as if he owned it, which, in his mind, he probably did. "Clara tells me you're looking for a house," Marcus began, foregoing any pleasantries. "Good. It's time. A man needs to provide a proper home for his wife." He slid the binder across the coffee table. "I've had my people draw up a list of suitable properties. All in our neighborhood, of course. Proximity is important for family." Liam opened the binder. It was filled with listings for sprawling, ostentatious McMansions, each one more garish than the last. They were the architectural equivalent of a scream for attention. "These are quite grand, Marcus," Liam said, his voice neutral. "They're Thorn-worthy," Marcus declared. "Now, the financial side. Obviously," he continued, leaning forward with a conspiratorial air, "a man in your position can't be expected to swing this kind of purchase. It's no fault of your own. Different leagues," he smiled, a predator's baring of teeth. "So, the family is going to help. We'll extend you a loan. A private mortgage, if you will. Very generous terms. Consider it a wedding gift." It was a masterstroke of condescension. The offer was presented as generosity, but it was a leash. It would indebt him to them, not just financially, but emotionally. It was a constant, tangible reminder of his supposed inadequacy. Clara, who had entered the room with a tray of drinks, beamed. "Isn't that wonderful, Liam? Daddy is going to give us our dream house." Liam looked at his wife, her eyes shining with gratitude towards her father. She couldn't see the cage being built around them because the bars were gilded. He could have ended it right there. He could have opened his laptop, shown him a bank statement, and bought the entire neighborhood in cash just to watch the looks on their faces. But that would be a reaction, not a strategy. This was a test, a crucial data point for Project Themis. He needed to know the absolute depth of his wife's blindness, the true measure of her loyalty. So he played his part. "That's very generous, Marcus," Liam said, his voice quiet. "I don't know what to say." "Nothing to say, my boy." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder, the gesture more proprietary than affectionate. "It's what family does." The process was a systematic dismantling of Liam's autonomy. The Thorns chose the house, a cavernous white elephant with a 2-story foyer and more bathrooms than a hotel. They advised on the renovations, overriding Liam's professional opinions with gaudy, trend-driven whims. They hired the decorator, a sycophant of Clara's mother who filled the space with velvet, brass, and an astonishing number of leopard print accents. Liam endured it all with an unnerving placidity. He would stand in the middle of a room, a whirlwind of decorators and contractors swirling around him, his expression serene. He would watch as Clara and her mother, Delia, debated the merits of gold leaf on the ceiling, his silence mistaken for meek acceptance. What they didn't see was the architect's eye, calculating, observing, noting every flaw, every weak point, every deviation from sound design. He was not just watching them build a house. He was watching them build a monument to their own hubris. The day of the closing was the apex of the humiliation. It took place not at a lawyer's office, but in the formal library of the Thorne family estate. It was staged for maximum theatrical effect. Marcus, flanked by his personal attorney, sat behind a desk large enough to land a helicopter on. Liam and Clara were seated opposite, like supplicants before a king. Before the signing, Marcus stood and delivered a small speech. He spoke of the importance of family, of tradition, of providing for one's own. His words were ostensibly for everyone, but his gaze was fixed on Liam. In this family, Marcus intoned, we lift each other up. We provide a foundation where one is lacking. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be in a position to give you two this start, to provide Clara with the home she deserves, a home befitting a Thorne. The implication was brutally clear. Liam was the lacking foundation. He was the charity case, the man who could not provide. Clara wept, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Thank you, Daddy, she whispered. The lawyer pushed a mountain of paperwork towards Liam. If you'll just sign here, Mr. Sterling. Liam picked up the pen. He could feel their eyes on him, a collective weight of pity and smug superiority. He glanced at Clara, who gave him a small, encouraging smile, completely oblivious to the indignity of the moment. He thought of the ledger in his desk. He thought of the vast, silent network of assets he commanded. He thought of the file he had already prepared on Thorne Consolidated, a company far more fragile than its patriarch believed. He touched the edge of his worn leather portfolio, which sat on the floor beside his chair. Inside were blueprints, not for buildings, but for a meticulously planned deconstruction. The documents in front of him were just one more piece of evidence. With a steady hand, he signed his name, Liam Sterling. The signature was clean, confident, the hand of a man who designs things to last. He had just willingly placed the collar around his own neck. It was a necessary move. To truly expose the rot in the House of Thorne, he first had to let them believe they owned him completely. He had just given them the rope. He would give them a little more time to enjoy it before he used it to pull their entire world down. The years that followed were an exercise in calculated patience. Liam settled into his role as the quiet, ineffectual husband, a fixture in the Thorne family drama, mostly ignored but occasionally trotted out as an example of their magnanimity. He was the court jester they didn't realize was a king in disguise. Meanwhile, Thorne Consolidated, the family's sprawling and inefficient empire of real estate and retail, was embarking on its most ambitious expansion yet. Marcus, feeling the pressure of his own mortality, was obsessed with cementing his legacy. He spoke of it endlessly at the Sunday dinners that Liam was forced to attend. These dinners were Liam's primary source of intelligence, a weekly briefing delivered by an enemy who believed he was speaking to an empty chair. We're acquiring the Argent Group, Marcus would announce, stabbing a piece of roast beef. Their portfolio is undervalued. The board is weak. We'll swallow them whole by Q3-inch. The financing is already secured, Julian would add, puffing out his chest. I handled the negotiations with the bank myself. They were eating out of my hand. They spoke of leverage, of hostile takeovers, of market domination. They never once looked at Liam. They never once asked his opinion. He was the architect of little buildings, a man who thought in terms of community centers, not corporate conquests. The dramatic irony was so thick Liam could almost taste it, richer than the ridiculously expensive wine they served. What they didn't know was that the bank Julian had negotiated with was a subsidiary of a holding company Liam controlled through 3 layers of impenetrable trusts registered in Liechtenstein and the Cayman Islands. The undervalued Argent Group portfolio had been deliberately suppressed by a consortium of investors Liam had assembled, preparing it for a low-cost acquisition by an entity of his choosing. He was not just listening to their plans. He had written the script they were unknowingly following. His life became a carefully compartmentalized performance. In the opulent, leopard print monstrosity of a house he now lived in, he was Clara's quiet husband. He would listen to her endless chatter about social engagements and her mother's latest feud with the garden club. He would nod and smile, his mind miles away, running complex financial models or reviewing legal frameworks. But in his study, the one room in the house they had allowed him to furnish himself, the mask came off. The room was his sanctuary, his war room. Late at night, when the house was silent, he would slip inside and the true Liam Sterling would emerge. He wasn't just an architect of buildings. He was an architect of systems, of empires. There were quiet phone calls, made on encrypted lines to numbers in Zurich, Hong Kong, and London. His voice, usually so mild, would become crisp and authoritative. Alistair, confirmed the transfer to the holding account. Phase 4 is a go. The final pieces are in place. The proxies have been secured. Initiate on my signal. No, the terms are non-negotiable. They will accept, or they will be rendered insolvent by morning. Their choice. His interlocutors knew him not as Liam Sterling, the mild-mannered architect, but as Argent, the mysterious and brilliant financier who had appeared out of nowhere a decade prior and had never once made a losing move. They knew him as a man whose word was iron and whose strategies were labyrinthine and flawless. During the day, the humiliation continued unabated. Julian, who had been given an executive title at Thorne Consolidated that far exceeded his abilities, took particular delight in mocking Liam. He'd find Liam sketching in his notebook and sneer, "Still playing with your little drawings, Liam? While you're drawing houses, I'm buying city blocks." Liam would simply look up, smile faintly, and say, "Everyone needs a hobby, Julian." He didn't bother to mention that the city block Julian was so proud of had been acquired using a line of credit ultimately guaranteed by Liam himself. His wife, Clara, remained his greatest disappointment. She was so thoroughly indoctrinated into the Thorne cult of status that she was incapable of seeing the man right in front of her. She saw his patience as weakness, his quietness as a lack of ambition. She would constantly encourage him, which was her form of criticism. "You know, Liam, my father could find a place for you at Thorne Consolidated. A real job. You wouldn't have to worry about chasing small contracts anymore." "I'm happy with my work, Clara," he would say, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But you could be so much more," she would insist, genuinely believing she was helping him, never once considering that he already was. The confidence of the Thorns swelled to an unbearable, fever-pitch crescendo. The Argent Group acquisition was proceeding flawlessly, just as Liam had designed it to. Marcus was insufferable, holding court at every opportunity, pontificating about his own genius. He saw himself as a titan of industry, a modern-day Carnegie, completely unaware that he was merely a puppet, his strings pulled by the silent man sitting at the far end of his dinner table. One afternoon, Liam was in his study, reviewing the final set of documents for what he now called the reckoning. It was a thick stack of papers detailing the transfer of controlling interest, the dissolution of the current board, the legal justifications for the seizure of assets. Everything was ready. He needed only to choose the time and place. He ran a hand over the worn leather of his portfolio where the executive orders, the signed, sealed death warrant for the Thorne Empire, now resided. Clara entered without knocking, a habit he despised. She was holding a new suit jacket, a flashy, pinstripe thing that screamed nouveau riche. "I bought this for you," she announced. "For the gala. The one celebrating the Argent acquisition. You can't wear one of your dreary gray suits. You need to at least look like you belong." He looked at the jacket, then at her. Her face was a mask of cheerful condescension. It was in that moment he decided. The celebration gala was too public. The final act of this drama needed to be intimate. It needed to be in their space, at their table, in the heart of their delusion. He smiled, a genuine, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you, Clara. That's very thoughtful." He would let them have one last celebration, one final dinner to toast their own success. And then he would burn it all to the ground. The time for quiet preparation was over. The storm was about to break. The night of the final dinner arrived, cloaked in an atmosphere of smug triumph. The Thorns had gathered in the formal dining room of the house Liam now technically owned, a fact still blissfully unknown to them. The air was electric with self-congratulation. The Argent Group acquisition had been finalized that afternoon. Marcus Thorne was at the pinnacle of his power, a self-styled king surveying his domain. The table was laden with the spoils of their perceived victory. Champagne chilled in silver buckets, a lavish spread of food, and a heavy, oppressive scent of expensive perfume. Julian was louder than usual, recounting his brilliant final negotiation tactics, a story that grew more heroic with each telling. Delia, Clara's mother, was already planning the redecoration of the Argent Group's headquarters. Liam sat in his usual place, a silent observer at the feast. He ate sparingly, his movements deliberate and calm. He had worn a simple, dark, impeccably tailored suit, not the flashy one Clara had bought him, and it made him seem like a shadow amidst their gaudy finery. His old leather portfolio was placed on the floor beside his chair, a silent, patient sentinel. Marcus raised his glass, the crystal ringing as he tapped it with a fork. "A toast," he announced, his voice booming with satisfaction. "To the future, to legacy, to the Thorn name, which has once again proven that vision, strength, and family are the cornerstones of greatness." His eyes swept the table, pointedly skipping over Liam. "To those who build, to those who build," Julian and Delia echoed. Clara, beaming at her father, repeated the toast, her eyes shining. The conversation flowed around Liam, a river of arrogance. They were already spending the profits, planning the consolidation, firing the old Argent board in their imaginations. Julian, flushed with champagne and self-importance, turned to Liam. "Big night for the family. Liam? Must be a bit over your head. All this talk of billions," he gestured to Liam's suit. "Glad to see you wore something decent for once. Though I think that tie is a few seasons out of date." Liam didn't respond. He merely met Julian's gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He was cataloging it all. Every slight, every condescending remark, every moment of casual disrespect. He was adding the final entries to the list of grievances he knew by heart. The main course was cleared away, and dessert was served. It was a ridiculously complex confection, a tower of spun sugar and gold leaf. It was a monument to excess, a perfect metaphor for the family itself. It was then that Clara, high on the success of her family, and perhaps a little too much champagne, turned to him. The look on her face was one she often wore when she was about to help him, a mixture of pity, frustration, and superiority. "Liam, darling," she began, her voice soft and cloying. "I know this must all seem very overwhelming for you. All these big deals, the money, the power. It's a different world." He remained silent, waiting. He knew this was it, the final, precipitating moment. She reached across the small space between them and patted his hand, a gesture one might give to a nervous child. "You have to understand, Liam. You're a guest here, in this house, in this family. You are a part of this because of me, because of us." She took a breath, summoning the words that would seal her own fate. "You bring nothing. You own nothing." The words landed in the sudden silence of the room with the force of a physical blow. Julian smirked. Marcus nodded, as if his daughter had just articulated a profound and necessary truth. Liam slowly withdrew his hand from under hers. He carefully picked up his linen napkin, dabbed at the corners of his mouth, and placed it deliberately on the table beside his plate. The finality of the gesture commanded their attention. He looked at Clara, and the placid mask he had worn for years finally dissolved. What was left was not anger, but a vast, cold, and devastating disappointment. The look in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. "Is that what you believe, Clara?" he asked. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the thick, celebratory atmosphere like a shard of ice. "After all these years, you truly believe that I own nothing?" Clara, flustered by his sudden intensity, tried to recover with a nervous laugh. "Well, it's not a belief, Liam. It's a fact. I mean, it's not your fault. It's just the way things are. Liam nodded slowly, as if accepting a great, sad truth. A fact, he repeated softly. He glanced at the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room, its pendulum swinging in a slow, inexorable rhythm. He looked at his own watch, a simple, elegant timepiece they had always dismissed as cheap. Then I suppose our guests are right on time. As if summoned by his words, the deep, resonant chime of the doorbell echoed through the house. The sound was alien, intrusive. No one was expected. A nervous-looking maid, hired for the occasion, scurried from the room. The Thorns exchanged confused glances. Marcus began to rise, a frown creasing his florid face. Who in God's name could that be at this hour? The hushed, frantic tones of the maid could be heard from the foyer, then the sound of heavy, determined footsteps on the marble floor. The footsteps of many people. The dining room doors swung open. Framed in the doorway was a man who commanded respect just by his presence. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that was the epitome of bespoke Seville road tailoring. His name was Alistair Vance, a titan of corporate law, a name whispered with awe and terror in the boardrooms of the world. He was a legal predator who had dismantled fortunes larger than the Thorns with surgical precision. And behind him, filing into the room with the grim, silent purpose of a Roman legion, was a procession of men and women in identical dark suits, each carrying a sleek, black briefcase. They moved without a sound, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. They arranged themselves along the wall of the dining room, a silent jury, an army of righteous executioners. 1, 2, 3. Liam counted them as they entered. All 14 of them. Marcus Thorn was on his feet now, his face mottling with indignant fury. What is the meaning of this? Who are you? This is a private residence. I demand you leave at once. Alistair Vance's cool gray eyes swept past Marcus as if he were a piece of furniture. His gaze found Liam, and for the first time that evening, the lawyer's severe expression softened into one of profound deference. Mr. Sterling, Alistair said, his voice a calm baritone that filled the room. We are ready to proceed. A stunned, horrified silence descended upon the Thorns. Their eyes darted from the terrifying figure of Alistair Vance to the quiet man they had just finished mocking. Mr. Sterling, Liam rose from his chair. His movements were fluid, unhurried. He was no longer the meek, unassuming husband. He was a man coming into his power, a giant who had been pretending to be small for so long he had almost been forgotten. He bent down and picked up his worn leather portfolio. "Thank you for coming, Alistair," he said, his voice now imbued with an authority the Thorns had never heard. He turned to face his wife and her family. Their faces were a gallery of shock, confusion, and dawning terror. Clara's mouth was slightly agape, the color draining from her cheeks. Liam's gaze was cold and clear. "You want to talk about ownership," he said, the quiet words landing like stones. "Let's talk about ownership." Clara's scoff was a brittle, desperate thing, the last gasp of her dying arrogance. "Ownership? What are you talking about?" "Liam, this is insane. Call these people off." She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she saw a stranger. The placid, agreeable man she had married was gone, replaced by this cold, commanding figure. "It's not a belief, Clara," Liam said, echoing her own words back to her with chilling precision. "It's a fact." He laid the worn leather portfolio on the polished mahogany of the dining table. The sound, a soft thud of leather on wood, seemed to thunder in the silent room. He unclasped it. The quiet click of the metal latch was the sound of a guillotine being released. Alistair Vance stepped forward, his movements economical and precise. He addressed the stunned Thorns, but his report was clearly for Liam's benefit. 10 years ago, he began, his voice devoid of emotion. Thorn Consolidated was on the verge of catastrophic bankruptcy. A series of ill-advised real estate ventures and over-leveraged acquisitions had brought the company to its knees. Your creditors were preparing to foreclose and dismantle the company for scrap. Marcus sputtered, "That's a lie. We weathered a difficult period, that's all." "A market correction," Alistair didn't even glance at him. At the 11th hour, an anonymous investor stepped in. This investor, operating through a privately managed fund known as Argent Capital, purchased the entirety of Thorn Consolidated's toxic debt from the creditors for pennies on the dollar. He then injected enough capital, through a complex network of shell corporations and trusts, to stabilize the company and fund its recovery. He paused, letting the information sink in. Julian looked pale, his bravado utterly gone. This investor, Alistair continued, set only one condition for his bailout. His identity was to remain absolutely secret, known only to me and a select few, until such a time as he, and he alone, chose to reveal it. All subsequent successes of Thorn Consolidated, the acquisition of the retail division that saved you in 14, the expansion into overseas markets, and yes, the recent purchase of the Argent Group, were funded, guided, and ultimately orchestrated by this silent benefactor. As Alistair spoke, a silent ballet of legal precision unfolded. For each milestone he mentioned, one of the 14 lawyers would step forward from the wall, open their briefcase, and place a thick, bound file onto the dining table. The flagship building in the financial district, the one whose prestige allowed you to renegotiate your credit lines, Alistair said. A lawyer placed a file. The patent acquisitions that gave you a market monopoly in smart home technology, another file. The political lobbying that resulted in the zoning changes for your most profitable developments, a third file. The pile of documents grew on the table, a mountain of evidence, a paper tombstone for the Thorn legacy. It was a physical manifestation of a decade of secrets, a monument to their blindness. When Alistair finished, the table was covered. The Thorns stared at it, their self-conception shattering in real time. Then Liam spoke. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a weight that crushed all other sound. He was not angry. He was a judge delivering a verdict that had been years in the making. He began his list of grievances. "Marcus," he said, his eyes locking with the old man's. "On Christmas Eve, 8 years ago, you called my life's work a noble hobby, you dismissed it." He gestured to the first file Alistair's team had placed on the table. Inside that file are the original architectural plans for the Thorn Consolidated flagship tower, the building that saved your reputation. My hobby became the cornerstone of your supposed comeback. I designed it. I funded its construction through a proxy developer. You simply put your name on it. He turned to Julian. "Julian, you have never missed an opportunity to mock my finances, my clothes, my lack of ambition. The trust fund you so carelessly draw from, the one that finances your sport cars and your designer suits, was established by me as part of the initial bailout. It was designed to keep you occupied and away from any important decisions where your incompetence might do real damage." Julian flinched as if he'd been struck. Finally, Liam's gaze fell upon his wife. Clara was trembling, her hand pressed to her mouth. The look in his eyes was not one of hatred, but of a profound, surgical sorrow. "And you, Clara," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "You laughed when your father belittled my work. You stood by year after year, while your family treated me as a lesser, a charity case to be pitted and managed. You urged me to be more, never once suspecting that I already was. You chose the glittering illusion of their wealth over the quiet substance of your own husband. Every single day, you made that choice." He let the accusation hang in the air, irrevocable and absolute. He wasn't just taking their company. He was taking their story, the narrative of their own success, and exposing it as the hollow fiction it had always been. The silence in the room was the silence of a tomb. The final, devastating blow was delivered with bureaucratic calm. Alistair Vance, with the air of a man presenting a foregone conclusion, stepped to the head of the table where Marcus had once presided. He opened the last, most slender file. "The network of trusts and holding companies that constitute the financial architecture of this arrangement is, by design, complex," Alistair stated, his voice as crisp as a freshly printed stock certificate. "However, they all ultimately report to a single parent entity. A master holding company known simply as Sterling Equities. This entity holds the controlling interest, 95% to be precise, in Thorne Consolidated, all its subsidiaries, its real estate portfolio, its liquid assets, and its associated family trusts. He paused, holding up a single sheet of paper. It was a simple signatory page, almost anticlimactic in its plainness. The sole benefactor, the chairman, and the undisputed owner of Sterling Equities is, and always has been. He turned the page around for all to see. At the bottom of the document, in clean, bold, unmistakable ink, was the signature, Liam Sterling. The name hung in the air, a final, quiet bomb that vaporized the last remnants of their world. Marcus Thorne made a sound, a choked gasp, and collapsed back into his chair. His face, usually a florid, healthy red, had turned a ghastly, waxy gray. He looked 100 years old. Julian stared, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air on a pier. His entire life, his identity as a young titan of industry, had just been revealed as a complete sham, a subsidized fantasy. But Liam only had eyes for Clara. Her face was a canvas of warring emotions, disbelief, horror, a dawning, sickening comprehension. Her eyes darted from the name on the page to the face of the man she had married, the man she had dismissed, the man she had told, not an hour ago, that he owned nothing. "No," she whispered, the word a fragile plea. "No, it's not possible. This is a trick. A horrible, cruel trick." "It was always possible, Clara," Liam replied, his voice gentle but firm, the voice of a teacher explaining a difficult but fundamental law of physics. "You just never bothered to look. You were so dazzled by the performance of wealth that you never questioned the structure beneath. You saw what you wanted to see, a quiet man of no consequence, because that story fit your narrative. You never asked me about my work, not really. You never asked about my finances. You assumed, and your family built an empire on that same assumption." Alistair Vance cleared his throat, bringing the proceedings back from the emotional to the practical. "As the majority owner and chairman, Mr. Sterling has this evening called an emergency meeting of the board, effective immediately." He looked directly at Marcus, then Julian. "Pursuant to Article 7, Section 4 of the corporate bylaws, I am authorized to inform you that you are both removed from your positions on the board of directors and as officers of Thorne Consolidated and all its subsidiary companies, effective as of this moment." One of the other lawyers stepped forward and placed 2 slim envelopes on the table in front of them. "Your corporate credit cards, access keys, and security credentials have been deactivated," Alistair continued, his voice a relentless, dispassionate tide. "The vehicles registered to the company are to be returned to the corporate garage by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Security will escort you from the premises should you attempt to enter any company property." He then delivered the coup de grace. "Furthermore, this estate," he gestured to the opulent room around them, "is an asset of the holding company. You will be given 30 days to vacate the premises. A full list of personal effects to be removed will be provided to you tomorrow." They were not just fired, they were being evicted from their own lives. The entire edifice of their identity, the company, the power, the homes, the legacy, had been built on a foundation of sand, and the man they had mocked had just kicked it out from under them. The great clock in the corner chimed the hour. The sound was like a death knell. The reckoning was complete. The lawyers filed out as silently as they had arrived, a retreating tide of dark suits and briefcases. They left behind a scene of utter devastation. The magnificent dining room, moments before a stage for triumph, was now a funeral parlor. The half-eaten dessert, with its absurd tower of spun sugar, looked like a ruin. The mountain of legal files on the table was their collective gravestone. The 3 Thorns were frozen in their chairs, trapped in the wreckage. Marcus, the once booming patriarch, was a shrunken, broken man, muttering to himself about betrayal and vipers in the nest. Julian stared into the middle distance, his face a mask of impotent rage. All the swagger and arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow, frightened boy who had just discovered the world was not his playground. And then there was Clara. She slowly turned her head to look at Liam, who remained standing, a solitary, immovable figure in the chaos he had wrought. Her expression was no longer one of shock, but of a desperate, clawing panic. The ground had vanished from beneath her feet, and Liam was the only solid thing left to cling to. "Liam," she began, her voice trembling. "Liam, you can't do this. Please, this is my family. This is my life. My father. You'll destroy him." Liam regarded her, and for the first time, she saw the man he had kept hidden. It wasn't a monster. It was a man of immense strength, of unshakable principle, whose patience she had mistaken for weakness. The quiet architect was gone, and in his place stood the master builder, the owner of it all. "Your father was already destroyed, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. His pride, his arrogance, his contempt for anyone he deemed beneath him, that is what destroyed him. He built his life on a lie he told himself every single day, that he was a self-made king. "All I have done is hold up a mirror. Your family didn't build an empire. They were the caretakers of mine." He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle upon her. "And you," he continued, his gaze softening with a sorrow that was more painful than any anger, "you chose that lie over me. At every opportunity, you chose it. I gave you a decade, Clara, a decade to see me, to stand with me just once, to defend my dignity as I have always defended yours. You never did." Her face crumpled. "I didn't know," she sobbed. "How could I know?" "You didn't know because you didn't want to," he replied, the truth of it sharp and clean. "It was easier to believe I was small because it made your family seem big. It was more comfortable." He then delivered the final, personal piece of the puzzle. "This house," he said, gesturing to the opulent room they stood in, the house her father had given them. "This house was never part of the company's assets. I bought it myself, with my own funds, before we were even married. The title has always been in my name, and my name alone." Clara stared at him, uncomprehending. "But the loan. My father." "The loan was a sham," Liam stated plainly. "A performance. I knew he would offer it. I knew how he would frame it. I allowed it to happen. I signed his papers, knowing they were legally meaningless. It was a test, Clara, the most important test of all. I wanted to see if you would stand up for your husband's ability to provide for you, or if you would bask in the false generosity of your father. You know which one you chose." She finally understood. Her entire life, the security she cherished, the status she worshipped, was a carefully constructed illusion, and the man she pitied was the architect of it all. "So what now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What happens to me?" Liam looked at his wife, the woman he had once loved with a quiet, hopeful heart. He saw the years of small betrayals, the thousand cuts of condescension. But he also saw the woman trapped inside the thorn-gilded cage. "I'm not a monster, Clara. I'm not your father," he said. "I do not take pleasure in destruction. I build things, and I honor my commitments." He took a step toward her. "So you have a choice, a real choice for the first time in your life. You can leave. You can go with your family and cling to the memory of a status that no longer exists. I will not see you destitute. I will provide you with a generous settlement, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Or," he paused, his eyes searching hers for any flicker of the woman he had hoped she could be, "you can stay here with me, and we can try, truly try, to build something real, not based on thorn money or sterling money, but on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, the kind of respect you have never once shown me." He was not taking anything from her that had ever truly been hers. He was simply taking back what was his. In the process, he was offering her the one thing her family never had, a chance at an authentic life. The choice was hers. The silence in the room was absolute as she stood on the precipice of her own future, forced at last to decide who she was without the name, the money, and the power she had hidden behind for her entire life. The weeks that followed were a quiet storm. The Thorn Empire did not collapse into ruin. It was methodically, efficiently, and brilliantly restructured. The rot was carved out. The sycophants and incompetents, like Julian, were dismissed. Talented, Overlooked executives who had languished under Marcus's arrogant regime were promoted into positions of real authority. The company, now openly helmed by Liam Sterling, began to transform. It became leaner, more innovative, more ethical. It began to reflect the character of its true owner. Liam moved his office from his small, independent firm into the CEO's suite on the top floor of the Thorn, now Sterling Tower. The view was panoramic, a god's-eye perspective of the city he had been quietly shaping for years. But he didn't feel like a god. He felt like an architect who had finally been given the chance to reinforce a beautiful but compromised structure. And Clara? She was gone. In the end, she could not make the leap. The choice he had offered her was too terrifying. To stay with him would have meant admitting that her entire life had been a lie, that her values were worthless, and that the man she had married was a complete stranger she had fundamentally misjudged. It was easier to cling to the wreckage. She chose her family. She left the day after the confrontation, her face pale and set. She packed her designer clothes and her jewelry, the hollow symbols of a life that had evaporated overnight. Liam watched her go, a profound sense of loss mingling with the quiet certainty that it was the only possible outcome. He had loved the woman he thought she could be, but he could not live with the woman she had chosen to be. As promised, he had his lawyers arrange a settlement for her, one that was more than generous. It was his final, silent act of a love that had died of neglect, not his, but hers. Marcus and Delia moved into a much smaller, rented townhouse, a bitter pill for a man who once owned half the block. Julian, stripped of his title and trust fund, tried to find a job, but discovered that his name, once a golden ticket, was now a liability. The story of the takeover, though not public, had spread like wildfire through the city's elite circles. No one wanted to hire the arrogant fool who had been so thoroughly and completely outmaneuvered. One evening, a month after that fateful dinner, Liam was alone in his study. It was the same room in the leopard print house, but it felt different. The oppressive weight of pretense was gone. The air was lighter. He had put the house up for sale. It held too many ghosts of disappointment. He was looking at blueprints for a new project, a foundation for affordable housing and arts education in the city's poorest district. It was a project he had wanted to fund for years. Now he could. Alistair Vance was announced and shown in. He was carrying a slim folder. "The last of the transfers are complete, Mr. Sterling," Alistair said, his tone formal but with an undercurrent of warmth. "It's all yours, clean and clear." "Thank you, Alistair," Liam said, gesturing for him to sit. "For everything. Your discretion over the years was invaluable." Alistair gave a rare, small smile. "It was the most interesting case of my career. A 10-year chess game against an opponent who didn't even know they were on the board." Poetic, he looked at Liam. "Are you all right, sir?" Liam looked out the window at the glittering city lights. "I am," he said, and he was surprised to find that it was the truth. There is a certain peace in resolution, in things being set right. He hadn't acted out of desire for revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy, emotional act. This had been an act of correction, a restoration of balance. He had not stooped to their level. He had simply raised the ground to his. The truth is that true strength is rarely loud. It is not found in the boastful pronouncements of arrogant men or the glittering displays of borrowed wealth. It is quiet. It is patient. It is the architect's hand drawing a line that will define a skyline a decade later. It is the foundation buried deep underground, unseen and uncelebrated, that holds the entire structure up. True worth is not in what you display, but in what you build. It is not in the name you inherit, but in the character you forge. Patience, integrity, and a quiet, unshakable belief in one's own value are the only materials that can create a legacy that will truly last. The Thorns had built their house on sand, and the tide had finally come in. Liam had built his on bedrock, and now he was finally free to build in the light. Liam chose a difficult path, but it was a path of integrity. He reclaimed what was his, but he did so without cruelty, offering a chance for redemption that was ultimately refused. What would you have done in his position? Would you have been as patient? Would you have forgiven Clara and given her that second chance? I'm fascinated to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us for this story. If it resonated with you, please show your support with a like, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of justice, vindication, and the quiet triumph of true character.